Next speaker is Malina Duma, and the title of her capstone is Development Without Borders, the Role of the Moldovan Diaspora in Moldova's Post-Soviet Transformation.
Thank you, Dr. Sven. So in case anyone might not know, Moldova is a poor country bordering Romania and Ukraine that's just slightly larger in size than Maryland, with a population of only 3.5 million. The country has little clout in the geopolitical arena and is forced to maintain a weak foreign policy as it balances relations between East and West. Moldova is remarkably dependent on external actors, including international organizations, foreign governments, and development agencies, as well as on remittances, which are money transfers received from Moldovans working abroad. Moldova needs strong advocates to help forge its path toward prosperity, and members of newly formed diaspora communities are well positioned to fill this role as they still have a large stake in the country's future. The Republic of Moldova is known for being a country of mass emigration, and in the context of issues such as human trafficking, children left behind, brain drain, and remittance dependency, migration is most often viewed in a negative light. My capstone paper attempts to provide a new narrative by examining migration trends from an opportunistic perspective that highlights how the knowledge and resources of Moldovans living abroad are helping to build and secure a promising future for Moldova, while also arguing that Moldova serves as a unique case study in the post-Soviet space. A relatively positive relationship between the diaspora and homeland in comparison to many other formerly communist countries has allowed the diaspora to become a key force for democratization and economic development, and the influence of the Moldovan diaspora is shaping Moldovan society in both direct and indirect ways. However, there's a great deal of untapped potential that could be harnessed in the future. So by assessing governmental policies and examining how Moldovan politicians view the diaspora, as well as how diaspora communities view Moldova, I hope I'll succeed in casting light on broader issues such as Moldova's domestic political scene and its prospects for European integration. So I'd like to start by giving an overview of migration trends to explain why Moldovans are leaving the country in such large numbers, where they're going, and whether the majority plans on staying abroad permanently. According to a 2012 report by the International Organization for Migration, approximately 720,000 Moldovans were living abroad in 2010, a number that makes up about 20% of the country's total population. And it's likely that the diaspora will only continue to grow, as a recent Gallup poll indicates that 32% of Moldovans would like to move abroad permanently. Low salaries and an overall lack of economic opportunities at home force Moldovans to seek education and employment abroad. The monthly average salary varies from $138 in the agricultural sector to about $200 in education and $550 in financial services. This average is almost 2.5 times smaller than in Romania and Russia, but due to relatively high costs of living in Moldova, partly due to the high price of gas charged by Russia, migration is often perceived as an absolute necessity for survival. During the first stage of mass migration from Moldova from 1990 to 1994, top destination countries included Turkey, Russia, Romania, Germany, and Poland. When bilateral labor agreements were signed with European countries in the 2000s, many Moldovans moved to Portugal, Greece, and Italy, and many technical specialists also settled in Canada with their families. Today, top destinations include Russia, Ukraine, Italy, the United States, Israel, and Germany. In contrast to migration trends from most former Soviet republics, women actually make up the majority of migrants, particularly for longer-term migration to the EU, which has a significant impact on the communities that they leave behind. Typically, Moldovans who have migrated after graduating from university are not working in their areas of expertise, and as a result, there's a great deal of what we call brain waste. Many women, for example, who worked as teachers in Moldova are now working as domestic caretakers in countries such as Italy. But I think we might see a change in this trend as more Moldovan students are studying abroad and then establishing their careers in those countries or in other countries in the West specifically. Now, before discussing Moldovan diaspora communities and diaspora policies in detail, I'd like to provide one definition of the term diaspora and explain what I mean by diaspora engagement. According to Yossi Shane, a diaspora includes, quote, people with a common origin who reside outside their perceived homeland, whether independent or not. They regard themselves or are regarded by others as members or potential members of the national community of their homeland, a standing that's retained regardless of the actual status of their citizenship inside or outside their homeland. So this is a purposefully broad definition. Now, a few examples of diaspora engagement policies and projects can include promoting remittances, utilizing the diaspora to encourage foreign direct investment and venture capital in the domestic market, incentivizing educational exchange programs for diaspora students, supporting volunteerism and philanthropy in the diaspora, and organizing cultural events abroad. Kingsley Aikens notes that most countries tend to pursue similar initiatives that are common in terms of philosophy and approach, but there's no one-size-fits-all diaspora strategy, since countries differ enormously in terms of their development status, the history and size of their diaspora, and also the resources that the government has to follow through with its policies. Now, getting back to Moldova specifically, the International Organization for Migration, again, has conducted 4 diaspora mappings of Moldovans residing in European Union countries, including Portugal, Italy, the United Kingdom, and France, as well as a mapping of Moldovans living in the Russian Federation. The research suggests that most Moldovan migrants living in the EU are in, quote, standby mode, meaning they're unsure if their futures lie abroad or in Moldova. And the decision to remain permanently abroad or return home will depend on the social, economic, and political circumstances both in Moldova and in the host country. Approximately 20% of migrants who participated in the EU study have no intention of ever returning to Moldova at this point. There are also currently 154 registered Moldovan diaspora organizations around the world. Most of these organizations host Moldovan cultural events, such as an annual Marți Shore festival celebrating spring. These kinds of events are marketable, relatively simple to put together, and relatively non-controversial. The Bureau for Interethnic Relations in Moldova provides national costumes and other materials for these kinds of activities, and often they're also in conjunction with embassies or consulates abroad. Some diaspora leaders have created nonprofit organizations that are already contributing to Moldova's development through education and economic growth initiatives, such as Moldova Aid in North Carolina and Vatra in the UK. A broader base of Moldovans abroad has been mobilized to contribute to philanthropic activities as members of the Orthodox Church. Others have invested in Moldovan businesses or been active politically, either on their own initiative or through the Diaspora Council. Christina Batog, a CERES alumna and head of Casa Mare, a Moldovan diaspora organization based here in DC, is just one example of someone who is a tireless advocate and dedicated volunteer for Moldova's advancement. Given her experience working with nonprofits and U.S. governmental agencies, she's particularly savvy in her understanding of how she can make a difference. And although Moldovan diaspora leaders can conduct many activities on their own, the sustainability and scalability of these initiatives really hinges upon collaboration with the Moldovan government. Unfortunately, politics and corruption can often stand in the way. Now, Moldova has a difficult history, having been conquered by the Ottoman and Russian empires and then passed between Russia, Romania, and the Soviet Union over the course of the 20th century. After the Republic of Moldova officially declared independence in 1991, presidential and parliamentary elections showed a clear division between pro-Romanian, centrist, and pro-Russian or pro-Soviet camps, with the identity question serving as a line that divided the nation. Civil war even broke out with the separatist region of Transnistria in 1992, and although the period of bloodshed was brief, the frozen conflict is still a major impediment to Moldova's growth. The Moldovan government attempted to develop a state based on civic culture rather than ethnic identity, and international observers generally commended the Moldovans on their state-building principles, which differed dramatically from those of their neighbors. Despite these efforts, however, Moldova has remained the only country in Eastern Europe in which substantial disputes persist among political elites over the very fundamentals of national identity, with the major question often being, are we Moldovan or are we Romanian? It's interesting that from 1991 to 2001, it's estimated that between 95,000 and 300,000 Moldovans reacquired Romanian citizenship, and more than 500,000 applications were submitted in 2006, and remember this is a population of just 3.5 million. One might think that this would further aggravate the national identity issue, but it doesn't seem that the acquisition of dual citizenship makes Moldovans any less patriotic. In most cases, acquiring a Romanian passport, especially after Romania joined the EU, was a means to an end, particularly in terms of migration. And although when I speak to Moldovans individually, they'll typically gloss over the identity issue as unimportant or usually a thorn in their side, at most events I've attended on Moldovan Diaspora Engagement, including the most recent Diaspora Congress that was held in Chisinau in October 2012, this topic always succeeds in riling up the crowd and detracting from the productiveness of the conversation at hand. It's embedded in the overarching fight for power among major political personalities that we've seen highlighted in the volatile situation that's been unraveling in Moldova over the past couple of months. The best way to move forward might be to work more on the local level to avoid becoming embroiled in the messy political scene in Chisinau. The government should also seek to be inclusive of all members of the Moldovan diaspora, including ethnic minorities, which could involve more outreach using the Russian language. It's also interesting to note that the last Diaspora Congress, which was the 5th held in Chisinau, it was the first time that they didn't supply any materials in the Russian language or have any kind of translation, which when you talk to Russian minorities in Chisinau, that's what's highlighted on TV and that's what people really take an issue with. So it's something to consider in the future. Now, although political parties in Moldova are often accused of only being interested in the diaspora when they're seeking their votes and the votes of those in their sphere of influence, new policies and projects indicate that the government sees value in engaging the diaspora on other levels. And Prime Minister Vlad Filat institutionalized his commitment to the diaspora by creating a Bureau for Diaspora Relations within the State Chancellery in 2012. This was an important step for improving communication with the diaspora and coordinating the activities of the many ministries that play a role in supporting Moldovans abroad or their relatives back home. One major initiative supported by the Moldovan government is PARA 1+1, the program for attracting remittances into the economy that was launched in 2010. The state matches every leu invested by a Moldovan migrant or his or her direct relative up to 200,000 lei, which is approximately $16,000, to launch a new business or develop an existing enterprise, particularly in your rural areas. The program also includes business trainings and access to the resources of a small business incubator for up to 3 years. International organizations and consultants have been providing a great deal of capacity building support to the government in the area of migration and development, and this situation supports the point I made earlier about Moldova being so reliant on external actors. Given the political nature of diaspora engagement, however, it's particularly useful to have neutral parties involved that can see the bigger picture. The Nexus project, funded by the EU, is working with a number of partners, including the Bureau for Diaspora Relations and 4 local municipalities as a pilot. This project's activities help collect additional information about the diaspora, promote diaspora savings in Moldova, and are building the foundation for hometown associations. Kathleen Newland of the Migration Policy Institute in DC, who actually just joined us, recently took a group of Moldovans involved with this work on a study tour to Ireland to learn from the innovative ways the Irish have engaged with their diaspora. The Bureau is planning to implement similar programs, including promoting a return to Moldova in 2016 to celebrate Moldova's 25th year of independence. Although the Bureau's leadership and the Liberal Democrats, Vlad Filat's party in particular, seem to have stronger ties with Moldovans living in Europe and North America, Kathleen's been pushing them to direct more attention to Moldovans living in Russia, Israel, and Turkey, since people of Moldovan descent are there in large numbers, but it'll take a more targeted effort to get them involved with governmental initiatives, since they're not working closely with the Alliance for European Integration, as are some diaspora leaders in the West. To conclude, I'd like to make a few points as to why Moldova stands out as a unique case study of diaspora engagement in the former Soviet Union, and emphasize the importance of the continuation of smart policies in this area for Moldova's future. Although academic literature on post-communist diaspora engagement is somewhat limited, what I did find focuses mostly on the extreme nationalist tendencies found in the diaspora, or on ethnic discrimination surrounding post-Soviet diaspora laws that were adopted in many countries, but not in Moldova. But the most outspoken Moldovan diaspora leaders seem to be based in Western countries where there's a strong support for civil society and democratization, and they're focused on supporting Moldova's path toward EU integration above all else because they perceive this as being the best path for development. From my research and interviews, I would say that members of the Moldovan diaspora in Europe and North America are particularly invested in the development of their country of origin, since if the situation were to improve, they could see their futures or the futures of their children back in Moldova, and almost all of them still have family and friends living there. As a result, they're especially vocal in pushing the Moldovan government to secure bilateral agreements that support visa liberalization and transfer of pensions between Moldova and destination countries for migration. In addition, the Diaspora Council, largely dominated by Moldovans living in the EU, publishes open letters to the Moldovan government when it perceives that politicians are setting Moldova back in terms of its EU prospects. Now, the vast majority of Moldovans migrate to Russia and Ukraine, and they don't seem to be as aware of diaspora organizations or how the Moldovan government can support them. This is partly due to the fact that many are either circular migrants that often return to Moldova, or they integrate into their host societies relatively quickly and easily due to cultural and linguistic familiarity. And now is really the crucial time for the government to be developing strong relations with Moldovans around the world because they still have ties to the country and a great love for it, despite the many political and economic frustrations. On the whole, Moldovans are incredibly smart and adaptable, and as they become settled in their lives abroad, I predict that many more will be very successful in their chosen careers. It's highly probable, however, that unless the situation in Moldova improves drastically over the next 10 to 20 years, second and third generation Moldovans will not give any thought to moving back to the country and will become more and more disconnected. Given Moldova's small size, it's really rather amazing to know that you're likely to run into a Moldovan anywhere in the world. Unlike some diasporas that have major hubs in a few cities, Moldovans are very spread out but still well connected through technology. From the communities of Moldovan truck drivers in Tacoma and Sacramento to businessmen in Russia and scientists and politicians in Israel, Moldovans have acquired a diverse set of skills and experiences that can someday contribute to Moldova's social and economic development, and in some cases already are making an impact. Although it's going to be a difficult path forward, and budgetary constraints right now are certainly one issue, I think the opportunities for diaspora engagement are truly boundless, and I'm really excited to see where things go over the next few years. So thank you very much for your attention, and I think I've left quite a bit of time for questions and comments because I'm really interested to hear your feedback.
Thank you. Questions, comments?
A question, does the Moldovan diaspora community have an influence on the conflict in Transnistria? Or I guess also, following off of that, do they take a position, I guess one way or the other, generally speaking?
I'm really glad you asked that question, actually, because that's something I thought about bringing up, but I haven't looked into it that much, but I actually went to an event at the Woodrow Wilson Center on Transnistria and asked a former OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, ambassador, head of the mission, about that. I asked him if diaspora has played any role, if they show an interest, and he said, no, absolutely not. And that's what I found when in Moldova, meeting with other people who are working for the OSCE now. I also kind of brought it up. Didn't see that there was any influence. And I think it's an interesting point because a lot of diasporas have played a role in conflict resolution, and it doesn't seem like anyone's been interested in tapping into that resource. One of my first meetings with IOM, I was talking to Gennady Crețu, who's the diaspora activities leader there, and he mentioned that Transnistrians actually accounted for one of the first major Moldovan diaspora populations because they left the region as refugees during the conflict. So it'd be interesting to learn more about those communities, but I haven't really gained access to them. I'm not really sure, but the answer basically is no, they haven't shown an interest. It's not something that comes up at the Diaspora Congress. So, thanks for asking.
Let me ask you, as you pointed out, the majority of the migrants, in fact, are in Russia and Ukraine, but the most politically active and best organized are in Europe. And they favor Moldova's EU integration. I don't know, do you have percentages? I mean, what percentage of the migrants are in Russia, Ukraine?
80%.
80%, okay.
Yeah, but I would say to caution a little bit about any statistics on migration, because I was reading through the most recent report by IOM, and they cite statistics from different statistics from a number of sources, but that's obviously an overwhelming trend, so it's the vast majority.
But one has to assume, right, that the 80% or whatever they are, the people in Russia and Ukraine are actually not that concerned about Moldova's EU integration, right? So, is there any kind of link up between the diaspora groups that are in Europe and those in Russia, Ukraine, or is it are they more or less they kind of exist and operate independently?
Well, they all do come together for these major events like the Diaspora Congress. There was quite a bit of representation from Ukraine, from Russia, from Belarus. But I would actually say, I wouldn't say 100% Moldovans in Russia are not interested in EU integration because it's also very difficult to distinguish between circular migrants going to Russia and permanent migrants because the diaspora mapping that IOM commissioned for Russia was the first time that they interviewed Moldovans in Russia and Moldovans in Moldova. Usually they just talk to Moldovans in Moldova who travel back and forth from Russia, and what they discovered is that it's a very different group of people you're talking about that are permanent migrants in Russia. But a lot of Moldovans that are there now or keep coming back the political patterns or the voting patterns mirror those in Moldova. So the same number of Moldovans living in Russia support EU integration as Moldovans in general in Moldova. It's just there's an overwhelming majority of Moldovans living in Europe that support EU integration, obviously, as opposed to the general trends. So, and that's why Vlad Filat's party has been so focused on building these strong ties with the Moldovans in Europe, especially in Italy, because they provided the swing vote in the last 2 rounds of parliamentary elections, because they voted overwhelmingly for the Liberal Democrats. And also the other parties in the Alliance for European Integration, the Democrats and the Liberals, aren't as enthusiastic about diaspora engagement policies because they didn't receive the votes. Even though they're supporting their alliance, they didn't vote for their parties in particular. But if that answers your question.
Sure, it does.
Jessica.
What's the relationship between the Moldovan diaspora and the host countries that they've migrated to? And is there an impact on what that relationship is as to whether or not you're going to see more migration to those countries, or whether or not the people want to stay or return back to Moldova?
Absolutely, it makes a huge difference. I need to look even more carefully about the diaspora mappings because they just came out recently. But one thing that I noticed is that if a country grants citizenship more easily to foreigners, then they're much more likely to stay there. Whereas a lot of Moldovans that have moved to the UK are thinking about moving back, because in Portugal, for example, a lot of people have received citizenship, and networks are extremely important to Moldovans, and so this is something that the diaspora mapping brings out as well, that you have trends of migration from certain villages to certain countries, and the people go where they know people, but whether or not they're going to stay depends on if they have a good job and whether they can get property there and they have their family. And if you get married abroad to a national there, then you'll stay, and it just becomes your kids learn the local language and they're integrated into the school system, so that makes a huge difference. Yeah, Scott.
Just a quick question: what's the intent when migrants first go abroad? Is the intent to be as a temporary status in which they would then send remittances back to family members, or is it meant more of do they migrate with the intention of putting down roots, and what are the implications, I guess, for that?
I think the majority go abroad thinking it's going to be temporary, and they really do want to return to Moldova. So for example, to Portugal, when people were moving there in the 2000s, when they have this bilateral agreement with Portugal, they were planning to go and make money and sending remittances back, but then the situation wasn't improving in Moldova, and more people moved to Portugal, and you have your community there, and then it just becomes less and less likely that you're going to move back again if you get citizenship and that kind of thing, because you're waiting around to see if things will change. And the situation in Moldova isn't great, and it because it's so donor dependent, especially, it's 17% of the central government's budget is donor official development assistance, which is a huge percentage. I've just been looking at this recently too. It's 1% in Ukraine, and at the height it was 30% in Moldova in the 2000s. So the EU, I would say, is really kind of dictating what Moldova's policies, and that's not a bad thing, because a lot of the measures being taken to get Moldova ready to integrate more fully into Europe is benefiting the country, but at the same time, the government itself doesn't really have a lot of ownership over that. But at the same time, you also see a lot of Western-educated Moldovans coming back and working in the government, and that's the case with Victor Lutenko, who is the head of this new Bureau for Diaspora Relations. He's a young guy, he's very smart, very innovative, excited to do new things, and other people in the government sometimes are more from the previous generations that aren't as interested in working harder and forging a new path. They're just kind of interested in maintaining the status quo. So I think I kind of lost the question there, but sorry.
On the Bureau of Diaspora Relations, what do they sort of say when they communicate to the diaspora? Is their purpose of engagement? Is it more for reinvestment, or is it more for re-immigration to attract Moldovans back? And does it vary by group that they're speaking to?
It definitely does, and I think the Bureau itself is still carving out its strategy, and Kathleen's been helping them a lot with that. But what I noticed, at least in the beginning, was they're talking more about reintegration, and a lot of donor agencies that I've talked to as well about their interest in the Moldovan diaspora. it's not necessarily to make use of Moldovan networks abroad and, their careers there to contribute to Moldova. It's more, well, let's bring them back, and the EU probably would like that also. They don't want as many Moldovans moving into European countries. But I would argue that there's actually, right now, since those opportunities don't exist in Moldova for people to come back and make the same amount of money and have the same future in Moldova that they have in these other countries, what you really should be doing is figuring out what skills and resources the Moldovans have that are living abroad, what they're willing to contribute. And I think that the Bureau is looking at a lot of different possibilities for engagement, but they're also very focused on what they can give to Moldovans abroad. For example, healthcare policies and, like I mentioned, transfer of pensions and supporting them, because they're still interested in getting their votes and they still need to be showing that they're doing something for Moldovans living abroad. And that's still really important because a lot of Moldovans abroad are struggling too, or they need the support, whereas in some places they're very well established and they've been here for 25 years. It's not the case everywhere. So it's a mix of what we can do for Moldovans abroad, and then thinking in the future they are coming up with ways. They recognize that there's a lot of potential there, and they're looking at models of other governments, and I think that's really encouraging that they have an open mind and that they're willing to work with a lot of different partners.
Any more questions, comments?
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
I was
please,
just curious
sorry.
what the language situation is in Moldova. Like you mentioned that this is the first international diaspora conference where they didn't put anything out in Russian, and a lot of Moldovans go to Russia. So I guess my question is really more specifically, like, what is the state of the Russian language? Like, is this just a legacy of the Soviet period that people are speaking Russian? Are there people in Moldova whose native language is Russian as opposed to Moldova, or?
Thank you for that question too. Actually, that's a very good question. The percentage, I don't have the percentage off the top of my head of how many people speak Russian as, that don't speak Romanian. When you're in Chisinau, in the capital, you can go to certain places and only hear Russian, and so there are definitely still a lot of people that aren't really comfortable with the Romanian language. But when we're talking about the diaspora, people left the territory of Moldova when it was the Russian Federation, when it was the Soviet Union, and they don't speak Romanian at all. So if you want to tap into those resources, or you want to encourage people to come back to Moldova, there need to be possibilities to work in the Russian language. And I know people in the United States who have moved from Moldova because they don't speak Moldovan and they couldn't build a career there. You can't be a lawyer, you can't be a doctor in many cases if you don't speak the state language. And then one point about, well, I don't know, we won't get into the language politics. Okay, I'm not going to go into it, but I think that answers your question.
Yes.
So it's more about the opportunity to tap into the resources of diaspora communities that left at a time when they didn't need to speak the state language, and especially in Israel, that there are a lot of really talented scientists, especially there, that moved a long time ago, and that could be utilized. And the Academy of Science does work with the skilled diaspora in a lot of other countries, and they work in Russian and English and Romanian, so they put out a targeted effort, but they also are criticized sometimes for having kind of a communist legacy too, so maybe that's part of why they're more open to those communities.
Great, thank you very much.